I don't think I did anything wrong. I just called him a nobody in front of everyone. It was supposed to be a joke. People laughed. I laughed. So why did he look at me like I'd broken something I couldn't fix? Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible stories. I'm Vadin, and I swear I didn't do anything wrong. It was just a joke. One of those light moments people remember for a laugh, not a scandal. We were at our anniversary dinner, the restaurant full, candles flickering, friends filming little clips for their stories. Mason was sitting across from me, quiet as always, and I thought he needed loosening up. So I said it, that teasing line about how I'd married a nobody who somehow made me somebody. People laughed, I laughed, he didn't. I thought he was being dramatic. I didn't know that silence could mean danger, the calm kind that gathers proof instead of anger. Later, he just looked at me and said we'd talk properly soon. I brushed it off, posted the clip online, and watched the likes roll in. Everyone said I was funny, brave, real. That kind of attention feels addictive when you've been ignored too long. But now, looking back, I wonder if that was the moment he stopped being my husband and started being something else entirely. Methodical, distant, preparing. I used to think control meant speaking louder. Turns out, it can also mean saying nothing at all. I woke up that morning feeling restless, the kind of restless that makes you pick a fight just to feel something. Mason was already gone, which wasn't unusual lately. His coffee mug was rinsed, upside down on the drying rack, and the bed on his side was perfectly smooth. It was such a Mason thing, tidy, silent, predictable. I used to find that comforting. Now it just made me feel like I was living next to a ghost who still paid the bills. I scrolled through my phone while eating toast, half looking at messages, half distracted by the video I'd posted the night before, a clip from the office happy hour. Me laughing with everyone, Mason's name popping up in a comment thread because I'd tagged him as the mysterious man who hates being social. People loved it. Over 1,000 likes overnight. One of my coworkers even wrote, "Mason's such a lucky guy." That made me smile. See? Everyone thought we were fine. When Mason came home that evening, he walked in with the same calm expression he always wore. He asked if I'd eaten. I said I had, even though I hadn't. He poured himself coffee, even though it was late, and sat at the table like a guest in his own house. I asked why he was so quiet. He said he didn't know what to say anymore. I told him that's what people say when they're out of arguments. He said it's what people say when words don't work. It sounded rehearsed, like a quote from a book. I told him I was too tired for poetry. He didn't answer. He just stood up, rinsed his cup, and set it on the opposite corner of the counter from mine. I stared at the distance between them, two mugs facing away from each other, and thought, fine, if he wanted space, he could have it. The next morning at work, people were still talking about my video. One of the girls in marketing said it was hilarious how I'd teased Mason online. "You're so bold," she said. "I'd never joke about my husband like that." I told her confidence keeps a marriage alive. They laughed and I laughed too, but inside, I felt a tiny spark of irritation. Why did they say I'd never? Like I'd crossed some invisible line. Mason always made me feel like that too, like there was a rule book I wasn't reading from. When I got home that night, I told him about the comments. He said he'd seen them. I asked what he thought. He said, "You enjoy attention." I said, "You enjoy pretending you don't care." He said, "It's not pretending." Then he walked off to the guest room. That guest room used to be my little creative space, full of old boxes, candles, half-finished art projects. Now it was his office. He'd moved his laptop in there, set up a second desk lamp, even taken the small printer from the hall cabinet. He said it was temporary, that he needed somewhere quieter for work. I didn't argue, but sometimes, late at night, I'd hear the faint hum of the printer or the tap of keys, and I'd wonder what kind of work needed to happen at 2 in the morning. Once, when I went in to bring him tea, he quickly closed a window on his screen. I asked what it was. He said, "Finances." I said, "You never cared about finances." He said, "Maybe I should have." His tone wasn't angry. It was careful, like every word had been measured before it left his mouth. Over the next few days, small things started to feel strange. A folder appeared on the kitchen counter labeled Utilities. Another one said Household. He'd never organized things like that before. He'd always been relaxed about paperwork. I asked if he was planning an audit. He said he liked to keep track of things. I laughed and said, "You're turning into an old man." He didn't smile. That night, I told my mother about it over the phone. She said men get weird when they feel insecure. "Just remind him who he married," she said. "You're the one who brings life into that house." She always says things like that, and I love her for it, even if she's the reason I sometimes push too far. 2 days later, we were at dinner with some friends from work. Mason had come because I'd begged him to. He sat beside me, polite but distant, answering questions with short sentences. At one point, one of my coworkers asked how long we'd been married. I said, "Long enough for me to realize I married the calmest man in the world." The table laughed. Mason smiled thinly. Someone joked, "That's better than marrying a nobody." I repeated it, laughing. "Exactly. A calm nobody." Everyone laughed harder. Mason didn't. He just looked at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. When we got home, he didn't say a word. He took off his jacket, hung it neatly, and went into the guest room. I stood outside the door, waiting for him to come out and tell me I'd embarrassed him. I was ready to argue, ready to spin it into another fight I could win. But he never came out. He stayed in there all night. The next morning, I noticed something new on his phone when it lit up on the counter, a calendar alert that said downtown 10:15 a.m. I asked what it was. He said, "Just an appointment." I said, "With who?" He said, "Someone professional." I said, "You're being cryptic." He said, "You're being curious." That was it. He grabbed his keys and left. When I told my mother about it later, she said, maybe he was planning something nice for me, a surprise. That made sense then. Now I see how wrong she was. That week, I threw myself into work. Our office was planning a small client dinner, and I loved being in charge. It gave me something to focus on, something that made me feel important. Cade, my ex from years ago, happened to be on the guest list. He'd always been charming in that effortless way. When he walked in, he hugged me a little too long. I saw Mason watching from across the room. He'd agreed to come because it was good networking. I smiled at Mason like nothing was wrong, but something in his eyes made me feel small. Cade made a few jokes. I laughed too loudly, and I could almost feel Mason's patience stretch thinner with every passing second. On the drive home, I said he'd been quiet all evening. He said there wasn't much to say. I asked if he was upset about Cade. He said, "I don't get upset." I said, "Everyone gets upset." He said, "Not everyone shows it." I told him that made him boring. He said, "Maybe boring is better than cruel." That word, cruel, hit harder than I expected. I said he was overreacting, that it was just a joke. He said, "That's what you call everything when it hurts someone." I told him I couldn't help that people liked me, that he should be proud his wife could light up a room. He said quietly, "You confuse light with heat." I didn't know what to say to that, so I turned on the radio. We didn't speak again the rest of the way home. Over the next few nights, the distance became almost routine. 2 mugs on the counter, his laptop shutting when I walked into the room. A faint smell of toner in the hall. Once, I caught him taking a photo of the bills on the fridge. When I asked why, he said, "Documentation." I said, "You're acting paranoid." He said, "You're acting surprised." It scared me, how calm he was. Not angry, not sulking, just steady, like a man walking towards something inevitable. That weekend, I invited friends over for drinks. I wanted noise, company, proof that my life was still normal. Mason stayed upstairs. When someone asked where he was, I said, probably reading about tax codes or something. They laughed. I laughed too. But later, when I went upstairs to find him, his door was locked. I knocked. He said he was busy. I said, "You can't ignore your wife forever." He said, "I'm not ignoring. I'm preparing." I told him he sounded like he was planning a battle. He said, "You already started it." I didn't sleep much that night. I lay in bed scrolling through my posts, rereading the comments about how confident and funny I was. Validation, even digital, always calmed me. Around midnight, I saw that Mason had been active online. His cloud account showed recent uploads. I didn't think much of it, but now I remember that soft notification sound, the one that said, "File uploaded successfully." Sunday morning, I found him in the kitchen reading something on his phone. I asked if he wanted to go for a walk. He said, "No." I said, "You could at least pretend you like me." He said, "Pretending is your specialty." I told him that was uncalled for. He said, "Truth usually is." Then he rinsed his mug again, set it down beside mine, and left without another word. I watched from the window as he walked to the car, his posture straight, his movements calm, controlled. It bothered me more than if he'd slammed the door. I wanted him to shout, to fight, to give me something to work with. But Mason never fought. He just waited, and I didn't realize then that waiting was the most dangerous thing he could do. That afternoon, I called my mother again. She said men get quiet before they do something stupid. I said Mason wasn't that kind of man. She said, "Maybe he's the kind who waits until you're sure he won't." That unsettled me. I looked around the house and noticed the little things. How every drawer was neatly closed, how the guest room door was locked again, how his keys now had an extra one attached, a new silver one I didn't recognize. By evening, I was pacing the kitchen, trying to decide if I should apologize for something I didn't even think was wrong. When Mason came home, I started to speak, but he stopped me with a small gesture. He said he was tired and that we'd talk properly soon. The way he said properly made me uneasy, like the word meant something formal, final. I watched him disappear into the hallway, calm as ever, while I stood there with my half-empty mug, realizing for the first time that maybe my laughter wasn't as harmless as I thought. The week after that quiet Sunday felt like walking on glass. Everything looked normal from the outside, but inside the house, the air felt thin and sharp. Mason barely spoke, but his silence had a rhythm to it, like he was keeping time with something only he could hear. He woke earlier than usual, made breakfast without asking what I wanted, and left before I finished my coffee. Every night he returned at the same hour, calm, polite, untouchable. When I tried to bring up the dinner where I'd joked about him being a nobody, he said, "We already lived that moment." I said, "So you're just going to hold a grudge?" He said, "No, I'm holding facts." I didn't even know what that was supposed to mean, but it made me feel like I was the one losing control. At work, people still talked about that dinner clip I'd posted. Someone had caught part of the toast on video, me laughing, Mason looking blank, and everyone else chuckling around the table. I hadn't realized someone was filming until I saw it trending in our small office group chat. The caption someone added said, "When confidence meets confusion." It had over 100 comments, mostly people defending me, calling me fearless for teasing my husband in public. I told myself Mason should be proud that his wife could handle attention like that. The comments gave me a little rush, that quick validation that always felt like air after a long, breathless day. When I got home, Mason was sitting at the table with his laptop open. He didn't look up when I came in. I told him about the clip and how popular it was. He said nothing. I said, "People think we're funny together." He said, "People see what you show them." I said, "That's what everyone does." He said, Not everyone edits the truth. That line annoyed me. I told him he was acting like a therapist with too much free time. He said quietly, "Free time is what happens when people stop trying to be heard." I wanted to throw something just to get a reaction, but instead I walked to the counter and poured wine. My mother called that evening, asking how we were doing. I said Mason was being cold again. She said he probably just needed reminding that men like him are lucky to have women like me. "He'll come around," she said, "once he realizes you don't need him to feel special." I told her she was right, that I'd always been the one who carried the energy in our marriage. Even hearing it made me feel better. It's strange how easy it is to believe something when you need it to be true. A few nights later, we had another dinner planned, this time at a co-worker's apartment. Mason didn't want to go. He said he was tired. I told him people would ask questions if he skipped again. He said, "Let them." I said, "You can't keep hiding." He said, "I'm not hiding, I'm watching." I rolled my eyes and told him he was being dramatic, but he came anyway, quiet as ever, following behind me like someone escorting their own reputation. At the dinner, I felt electric. Everyone laughed at my stories, clinked glasses, complimented my dress. Mason sat at the end of the table, polite, half smiling, like he was trying to fade into the wallpaper. I started talking about relationships, how they needed humor to survive. Someone asked if Mason ever got jealous of how confident I was. I said, "Jealous? He's lucky. I make us interesting." That got a laugh. I added, "He knows I'm the personality in this marriage. He's the calm background music." People laughed harder. I looked at him, waiting for him to play along. He just nodded and said, "You're right, I'm the quiet part." It sounded like an agreement, but there was something sharp under it. When we got home, he didn't follow me inside right away. He stayed in the car with the headlights off. I watched through the window. He was typing something on his phone. When he finally came in, I asked if he was texting someone. He said, "Just confirming a meeting." I said, "With who?" He said, "It's personal." I said, "You don't get to have secrets." He said, "You've had ours long enough." The next morning, there was another folder on the counter. This one said, "Bank." Inside were copies of receipts, account numbers, and printouts. I asked if he was auditing me. He said, "No, I'm building clarity." I said, "That's the most pretentious thing I've ever heard." He said, "Pretentiousness is talking about power while someone else documents the damage." I didn't even understand half of what he meant, but it made me furious. I told him if he didn't stop treating me like an enemy, I'd go stay with my mother. He said, "Then she'll finally get what she's been wishing for." I slammed the drawer shut so hard the folder edges crumpled. He didn't flinch. That Friday, my department threw a small rooftop mixer to celebrate a campaign milestone. I told Mason about it that morning. He said, "Do you ever just stay home?" I said, "Do you ever just live?" He said, "I'm living. You're performing." I told him that's what successful people do. They perform. He said, "Then I hope the applause is worth the silence that comes after." I left before he could say anything else. The mixer was beautiful. String lights, music, laughter bouncing off glass walls. Cade showed up again, looking smug and easy. He told me I looked radiant. I told him Mason thought I was performing too much lately. He said, "Then perform for the right audience." I laughed louder than I needed to. Someone filmed us again, the flash reflecting in a champagne glass. I saw my own smile in that light, sharp and wide, the kind that hides exhaustion. When I came home past midnight, Mason was awake. He was sitting at the dining table, laptop open, pen in hand, writing something in his small notebook. I asked if he'd been waiting for me. He said, "No, I've been finishing something." I asked what. He said, "Lists." I said, "Of what?" He said, "Everything you think I've forgotten." I told him that sounded obsessive. He said, "It's organized." I walked past him to the sink and saw 2 mugs again. His spotless, mine with lipstick smudges dried near the rim. I almost laughed at how consistent we were. He said, "You find that funny?" I said, "I find everything funny eventually." He said, "That's what scares me." The next few days blurred together. Mason's routine didn't change, but the silence deepened. Sometimes I caught him staring at me like he was memorizing my face. Once, when I reached out to touch his arm, he moved away. Not angrily, just efficiently. I said, "You're acting like I'm contagious." He said, "Consequences usually are." That night I dreamt about being in a room full of people laughing, but no sound came out of my mouth. I woke up sweating. By midweek, even my coworkers started asking if things were okay at home. I said yes, of course. I said Mason was just tired. Someone said they'd seen him downtown near the courthouse. I laughed it off, said they must have been mistaken. Mason hates paperwork, I told them. But the image stayed in my mind. The calm way he folds napkins, the folders labeled neatly, the strange calendar alerts. When I got home, I looked through his desk drawers. They were locked. I found the spare key in the kitchen, tried it, and the drawer opened with a soft click. Inside were tidy stacks of envelopes. One of them was labeled Household Summary. I opened it and froze. It was a list, dates, expenses, photos, even quotes, little notes in his small handwriting. Event, restaurant, comment, called me nobody. Date, rooftop, witness, Cade present. Video posted online, timestamp, public ridicule. It wasn't messy. It was precise, surgical. I felt dizzy reading it. When he came home later, I confronted him. I said, "You're keeping files on me?" He said, "I'm keeping records." I said, "That's insane." He said, "No, it's preparation." I said, "For what?" He said, "For when you tell everyone you did nothing wrong." I told him he was overreacting. He said, "I'm reacting exactly enough." He took the folder from my hands, slid it back into the drawer, and locked it. I said he was trying to intimidate me. He said, "You've been doing that to me for years." I told him not to talk like I was the villain. He said, "You'll get your story, Vadin. Just remember, I'll have mine too." Then he walked away, leaving me standing there in the quiet, shaking, furious and scared all at once. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying everything. The jokes, the looks, the way he said, "We'll talk properly soon." I started drafting a new post for social media, something about strong women surviving insecure men. I wanted to get ahead of the narrative, but I deleted it halfway through. The words felt empty. For the first time, I didn't know what story I was telling anymore. I stared at the dark doorway of the guest room, faint light glowing under it, the sound of a printer whirring again. I almost knocked, but something in me hesitated. I realized that whatever was happening behind that door wasn't an argument anymore. It was a process, and I wasn't the one running it. I tried to act normal after that night, but it felt like Mason's eyes were everywhere, even when he wasn't home. He didn't argue anymore. He didn't even sigh. He just existed in this measured rhythm, every movement deliberate, every silence perfectly timed. That was what made it unbearable. How calm he was. I'd have preferred yelling, anything that proved he still cared enough to lose control. Instead, he just kept documenting life like it was a project. The labels on his folders had multiplied. I found one titled Archive A, another labeled Expenses Shared. It was like watching someone build a museum of our marriage, exhibit by exhibit, except he was the only visitor. One morning, I saw his phone light up with another calendar alert. Downtown 9:40. I asked about it, pretending to sound casual. He said, "Errands?" I said, "You've been doing a lot of errands lately." He said, "You notice things when you stop shouting." I told him I wasn't shouting. I was trying to communicate. He said, "There's a difference between communicating and performing." Then he left for work without looking back. At the office, everyone was buzzing about a new campaign. My boss told me I'd be the spokesperson for our next video ad, something highlighting confidence and leadership. It felt like the perfect chance to prove that I was still the strong one. I could already picture Mason's face when he saw it online. He'd realize I wasn't just someone who made jokes. I was the kind of woman who turned them into power. I stayed late every night that week, practicing my lines, checking lighting, recording takes. The video was short, but it felt like a declaration. Own your story before someone else tells it. When it launched, my phone blew up. Likes, shares, messages. People loved it. Even Cade texted, saying it was pure fire. I replied with a laughing emoji and said, "Thanks, just speaking my truth." Mason didn't mention it. He didn't even look at the screen when I played it at home. He just said, "Interesting choice of words." I asked what he meant. He said, "You finally said something honest." I said, "You sound jealous." He said, "I sound finished." Then he went upstairs. The following weekend, my mother invited us for lunch. She said, maybe it would help if we spent time around family. Mason agreed without hesitation, which surprised me. He even brought dessert. The meal started off fine, quiet but civil. Halfway through, my mother started talking about how much attention my video had gotten. She said she was proud of me for standing tall. Mason nodded politely. Then she said, "You should be proud too, Mason. Not every man can handle a woman like Vadin." Mason said softly, "She's not hard to handle. She just doesn't believe she should be." My mother laughed, thinking it was a joke. I felt my cheeks flush. After lunch, Mason helped her clear the dishes. I stayed on the couch scrolling through my phone, pretending not to watch them. When they came back, my mother said, "You two need a weekend away. Something romantic." Mason said, "That's one way to spend time. I've been considering another." She asked what he meant, and he smiled gently. Nothing serious, just organizing what's already been decided. She looked confused, but he didn't explain. That evening, I told him he'd embarrassed me by acting cryptic in front of her. He said, "You do that to me in public all the time." I said, "Not the same thing." He said, "You're right. When you do it, people laugh." I told him he was twisting everything I said. He said, "No, I'm recording it." That phrase made my stomach tighten. "Recording?" I asked. "Like literally?" He looked at me calmly. "Not audio, just memory. I have a good one." I laughed, but it came out shaky. The next few days, he worked from home. The guest room door stayed closed most of the time, but I could hear muffled typing, the soft scrape of paper being sorted. I started checking his drawer again whenever he went out. The folders were multiplying. One night, I found a USB taped under a tax folder. I pulled it off and slid it into my laptop. Inside was a neat file tree: Archive A, Archive B, photos, statements. Each folder had subfolders with dates. I clicked one. It was full of screenshots, social posts, text exchanges, even a few of my old messages with Cade. My hand started to shake. I hadn't even realized he'd seen them. When he came home, I was waiting in the kitchen, arms crossed. I asked why he was spying on me. He said, "I'm not spying, I'm saving." I said, "Saving what?" He said, "Context." I snapped that he was acting paranoid. He said, "You built the narrative, I'm just archiving it." That word again, archiving, like I was a story being filed away. I told him he was making me feel unsafe. He said, "Now you know how it feels." I threw my coffee mug into the sink. It didn't break, it just rattled loudly. He didn't even flinch. Later that night, I went to check on Piper. She was sitting on her bed drawing. When she saw me, she asked, "Are you and Daddy mad?" I said no, of course not. She said, "He moved his clothes to the other room." I told her Daddy just needed space to work. She nodded but didn't smile. I sat there longer than I meant to, brushing her hair with my fingers. She said, "He said we'll always be okay." I asked when he said that. She shrugged. "This morning, when you were in the shower." The next morning, Mason left earlier than ever. I watched from the window as his car backed out of the driveway. He drove slow, like someone taking his time with every decision. When I turned around, I saw another sticky note on the fridge. "Bring forms." I asked him about it later that evening. He said it was just a reminder for errands. I said, "What forms?" He said, "You'll see when it's time." At work, Cade started visiting my office more often. He'd always had that easy way of filling silence. One afternoon, he said I looked stressed. I said, "Marriage stuff." He smirked and said, "You always make drama look elegant." That made me laugh. He offered to take me out for lunch. We went to a small cafe a few blocks away. I told him Mason was acting strange, all quiet and cryptic. Cade said, "He's probably intimidated. Guys like that crumble when they realize you don't need them." I liked hearing that. It reminded me of how I used to think, confident, untouchable. When we returned to the office, Cade brushed my arm as we walked in. I didn't pull away. A coworker saw and raised an eyebrow. I smiled as if I didn't care. That evening, Mason was already home, sitting on the couch with his laptop. He asked if I'd had lunch out. I said yes. He asked, "With who?" I said, "Coworkers." He nodded, not asking which ones. Then he said, "You should clear your schedule next Friday." I asked why. He said, "Something important's happening." I said, "You're being ominous again." He said, "Just organized." That night, I couldn't shake the unease. His calm was starting to feel like a countdown I couldn't hear. When I got into bed, he was still downstairs. I lay awake listening to faint noises, the rustle of papers, the soft beep of a phone notification, the creak of the drawer closing. Around midnight, I heard him lock the guest room door again. I almost went down to confront him, but something in my chest told me not to. Instead, I opened my own phone and scrolled through my feed. The video from work was still getting comments. Powerhouse. Goals. Queen energy. I reread them until my breathing slowed. It was easier to believe strangers than face whatever Mason was building in silence. The next morning, Piper was watching cartoons while I made coffee. She said, "Daddy said we might move soon." I froze. "He said that?" She nodded. "He said we might have 2 houses, so I'll get double birthdays." I laughed a little too loud and said, "He was joking." She said, "He didn't look like it." When Mason came into the kitchen, I confronted him. I asked if he was filling her head with nonsense. He said, "I just told her we'll both make sure she's happy, no matter where she is." I said, "That sounds like you're planning to leave." He said, "It sounds like I'm planning for peace." I slammed the coffee pot down, spilling a little on the counter. He took a towel and cleaned it calmly. Then he said, "You're very good at messes. I'm better at cleanup." He left for work and I stood there shaking, my chest tight with something that wasn't guilt but close enough to hurt. By afternoon, I called my mother again. I told her Mason was losing it, that he was making folders, notes, and weird plans. She said, "Maybe he's talking to a lawyer." I laughed and said, "For what? Being too calm?" She didn't laugh. "Vadin," she said softly, "some men don't yell. They just walk away once they've built their case." The way she said case made my skin crawl. I hung up without answering. That night, Mason didn't come home at his usual time. His phone went straight to voicemail. Around 10, the garage door finally opened. I met him at the stairs, ready to demand an explanation. He looked at me, eyes tired but clear, and said, "Everything's nearly ready." I said, "Ready for what?" He said, "For you to see what I've been doing." Then he walked past me and shut the guest room door behind him. The lock clicked. I stood in the hallway, heart racing, realizing I had no idea what was coming, only that whatever it was, he wasn't angry anymore. He was certain, and that certainty terrified me more than any argument ever could. The next week started like a play I didn't remember auditioning for. Mason's movements were so precise they felt choreographed. Up before sunrise, breakfast measured to the crumb, car engines starting at the same time every morning. Even his footsteps had rhythm. I began to feel like I was living beside a metronome counting down to something I couldn't name. I tried to keep things light, telling myself that control was his coping mechanism. He'd calm down eventually. Men always did once they realized I wasn't the villain they'd imagined. I cooked his favorite dinner one night, pasta with roasted garlic, and waited until he sat down before trying to sound casual. "I miss when you used to talk to me," he said. "You didn't like what I said when I did." I told him I missed his voice, not his criticism. He said, "That's the same thing." He ate quietly after that, thanked me for the meal, and washed his plate. I stood at the sink watching his hands move under the water. They were steady, sure. Too sure. The next morning, I dropped Piper off at school. She asked if Daddy would come to her art fair next week. I said of course he would. She said, "He said maybe." I told her he was busy, that adults say maybe when they mean yes, but can't promise it yet. She seemed to believe me, but I didn't. The word maybe lingered the rest of the day, humming in the back of my mind like static. At work, Cade stopped by my desk again. He'd heard about the family tension. Apparently, I'd mentioned too much at the last mixer. He said, "You can't let him dull your shine." I said, "He's not dulling anything." He said, "Then why do you look like you're always bracing for impact?" That made me angry. I told him he didn't know what marriage was like. He said, "You're right. I know what freedom feels like." His words stayed with me longer than they should have. That night, I found Mason sitting in the living room, laptop open, surrounded by paper stacks. "You're turning our house into a filing cabinet," I said. He didn't look up. "I'm putting things where they belong." I laughed bitterly. "And where do I belong?" He said, "That's what I've been figuring out." My throat went dry. "Are you threatening me?" I asked. "No," he said calmly. "I'm clarifying." Later, I went upstairs and called my mother. I told her I didn't recognize him anymore. She said, "He's probably seeing a therapist or an attorney. Men love structure when they feel powerless." I said, "He's not powerless. He's ice." She said, "Then melt him." But how do you melt someone who's already decided not to feel anything? The following weekend was supposed to be a family gathering at his sister Lara's house. Mason drove us there in silence. Piper sat in the back seat, humming to herself, unaware that her parents were barely breathing. When we arrived, Lara hugged him first, then me. I noticed how long she held on to him. The meal was uncomfortable. Small talk about work, weather, school. At one point, Lara asked gently, "How are things at home?" I said fine. Mason said, "Settled." She frowned. "Settled doesn't always mean peaceful." He said, "Peace is relative." She turned to me. "You've been quiet too, Vadin." I smiled and said, trying not to interrupt the philosopher. Mason didn't even blink. After lunch, I went to the backyard with Piper while Mason and Lara talked inside. I could see them through the window, their heads close, her hand on his arm. When we got in the car to leave, I asked what that was about. He said, "Family conversation." I said, "I'm family." He said, "So you think." I wanted to slap him then, just to make him break that calm face, but I didn't. I just sat there gripping the seatbelt until my hands hurt. That night, Piper woke from a nightmare. She said she dreamed we lived in 2 different houses, and she had to keep packing her toys back and forth. I told her dreams lie. She said, it didn't feel like a lie. I stayed in her room until she fell asleep, then went downstairs. Mason was still awake, writing again. I asked what he was doing. He said, "Making notes for next week." I asked, "What happens next week?" He said, "You'll find out when everyone else does." The next few days blurred together. He left early every morning, always dressed too neatly for his usual office work. His calendar had new alerts: meeting, personal, file drop, notary. Each time I asked, he gave the same quiet answer: "Just errands." I started checking his car when he left, nothing suspicious, just the faint smell of paper and toner, like his work had started following him everywhere. By midweek, the tension had turned heavy enough that even the air felt wrong. Piper avoided eating with us. Mason barely looked at me. I started to feel like a ghost haunting my own house. To distract myself, I met Cade for coffee after work. He said I looked drained. I told him Mason was acting like a stranger. Cade said, "He's planning something. Guys like that don't just withdraw for fun." I laughed nervously. What could he possibly plan? He's not dramatic. Cade shrugged. Even quiet people explode eventually. They just do it cleanly. When I got home that evening, Mason was sitting at the dining table with a closed folder in front of him. I asked what it was. He said, "A record." I said, "Of what?" He said, "Everything." I said, "That's creepy." He said, "That's accurate." I wanted to tear it open, but something about the way he kept his hand resting on it stopped me. His calm was a wall I couldn't climb. That night, as I brushed my teeth, I caught a glimpse of him in the mirror, standing in the hallway watching me. Not glaring, not sad, just observing. I turned and said, "Do you need something?" He said, "No, I'm just making sure you see me." The words sounded almost tender, but his eyes didn't match. I lay awake long after he went to bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself I was still in control. But deep down, I knew something irreversible had already begun. The kind of shift you only recognize when it's too late to turn it back. Mason started leaving earlier, his schedule tighter than ever, every move rehearsed. He barely looked at me anymore, but his calm made me nervous, like he'd already finished an argument I hadn't started yet. On the fridge one morning, a note in his small, perfect handwriting read, "Paper drop, 11:30 a.m. I stared at it for a long time, not sure if it was a message or a warning. At work, I couldn't focus. Cade came by my desk again, leaning too close, voice low. He said Mason didn't deserve someone who brought life into every room. I laughed, said marriage wasn't a competition. He said, "Everything's a competition to people who are losing." I told him he was ridiculous, but I didn't tell him to stop. It felt good to have someone still choosing me. That night, Mason was at the table with a stack of papers, his pen moving steadily. I asked what he was doing. He said, "Finishing something." I told him he was starting to scare me. He said, "Then maybe you're finally paying attention." I called him paranoid. He said, "Prepared." His tone wasn't cold, it was resolved. I hated that more than anger. Anger I could fight. Later, when I went upstairs, he followed. He didn't speak while changing into his nightclothes. I asked if we were really doing this, living like strangers in the same house. He said, "I'm not your stranger, Vadin. I'm your record." Then he lay down, closed his eyes, and left me standing there in the dark. The next morning, his desk drawers were empty. No folders, no notes. The printer was gone too. The only thing left was a small USB drive, labeled with that day's date. I tried to open it on my laptop, but it needed a password. My hands shook as I closed the lid. He was taking everything out of the house piece by piece, like a quiet evacuation. I called my mother. She told me to stop reacting. "He's documenting, not fighting," she said. "Don't feed his calm with your noise." I said, "You think he's bluffing?" She paused. "No, I think he's done." That night, Mason came home early. He was almost cheerful. He asked about Piper's art fair, told her he'd be there no matter what. When she ran upstairs, I asked where he'd been all day. He said, "Downtown." I asked, "Doing what?" He said, "Making sure everything is fair." I told him he was being dramatic, that whatever this was could still be fixed. He said, "You don't fix things by pretending they didn't happen." I said, "You're making a mistake." He said, "No, I'm documenting one." Then he opened a folder and took out a small recorder. He pressed play. My own voice filled the room. I married a nobody who somehow made me somebody. Laughter followed, mine, sharp and confident. I remembered that night, the way everyone had laughed with me. It didn't sound funny now. When the recording ended, he said quietly, "Public setting. Your words. No edits." I told him it was manipulative. He said, "It's evidence." I felt my face heat. I told him he was cruel. He said, "Cruel is pretending you didn't mean it." Then he picked up the recorder, placed it neatly back in the folder, and said, "I'll handle it properly." He didn't look angry or vengeful, just tired in a way that felt permanent. I wanted to shout, to undo the silence, but there was nothing left to push against. He'd already made his decision. I just hadn't realized the paperwork had already begun. It happened in the courthouse lobby, bright morning light spilling across the floor. Mason stood beside a clerk, while a man in a suit handed me an envelope, my name printed cleanly on the front. Inside, his petition, divorce, custody terms, property division, all stamped and dated. He signed the acknowledgement calmly, turned once toward me, and said nothing. Cameras flashed as the doors closed between us.